left before championship weekend, and we're down to 3 undefeated teams. Dumb loses more than smart wins with a contributing effort from a flag, and we'll break down exactly the fallout in the SEC. This is the College Game Day Podcast, Monday, November 18th. Rece Davis, Pete Thamel, and Ryan McGee here. So I guess it turns out that poor old Georgia, first team out, answered the bell against Tennessee in a big way in a game that, quite honestly, looked in the beginning as if the Volunteers might flex their muscle and prove to be one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the land, and they very well might prove that in the college football playoff. But the one thing that strikes me is that no matter how you stack up these SEC teams, Georgia, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Alabama, Texas, even Texas A&M, you can make an argument for any of them. You can make an argument against any of them. And the question becomes, Pete, is the SEC really separated from everybody else at the top in terms of depth of potentially elite teams? I know the Big Ten's got 4 of the top 5 in the rankings going into the weekend, but there is a lot of depth of potentially elite teams there.
Yeah, and I think, Rece,
there's like 2 distinctions here, right? Because the Big Ten, as the rankings would show, is clearly top heavy, maybe a little too top heavy in the rankings, quite frankly. But I don't think there's an argument that in terms of pure depth that the SEC has more of it just past the tippity top, right? I don't know how far off they are once you start matching 8 versus 8 and 10 versus 10 and that kind of a thing. But I just do think from, if you're talking about a 1 to 8 situation, I guess, I think it's pretty clear that the SEC has emerged as better. They've won the games out of league that they've needed to. And but I think that debate is going to shape this playoff as much as anything.
No, Ryan, that's exactly what I'm getting at, because if you look at, you can make the argument for anybody, and now it's starting to look like you might have a couple of Power 4 conference teams that will be one-bid leagues. We'll wait and see what the rankings say this week, and there are 2 more weekends of games to play prior to the championship weekend. But I don't know that you can look at that Georgia-Tennessee game Saturday night and tell me, absent one of them stepping on a rake the rest of the way and messing up their playoff hopes, you can't tell me, regardless of who won or lost, that both of those teams aren't playoff teams. It's hard to tell me that Ole Miss isn't, that Alabama isn't. And the same could be said for the Big Ten, but somebody's not going to make it, simply because there are only 12 spots to fill and 5 of them are guaranteed.
Yeah, and it's been interesting this year, everyone kind of operating sometimes under this assumption of, well, we can still get in with 2 losses. Well, you can. But you can't assume that you can. Everywhere we've been, and you guys know I'm in the SEC every weekend, and everywhere I am, well, we can have 2 losses and still get in. Well, you can't unless everyone else in the conference has 2 losses, which is kind of where it's going. And so that part fascinates me. And yeah, to y'all's point about, what it means in the room, it's also to me about the bottom half of the league, because, I don't want any part of South Carolina right now. I don't really want any part of Missouri right now. I don't want any part of Vanderbilt. When Florida decides they want to play.
Well, who do you want to play, Ryan? Who do you want to play? Double directional state? Come on.
That's it. But exactly right. And by the way, most of the teams in the SEC are going to play that school you just mentioned this weekend, because it's the next to last weekend of the year, right? But it is fascinating how they're so good, but I don't know if anyone is as deep as they were 3 years ago. Everyone's first 22 is pretty good, and now the question to me, as you get into the playoff, and I thought about this a lot with Georgia and Tennessee, and also the weekend before with Georgia and Ole Miss, which is, all right, your first 22 I know is good. And I would say that about most of the teams, in the conference, most of the teams in the top 10. We're talking about how good is your next 22. And I don't know if anyone is as deep as they were because of the way rosters work now. And so I think I think we could see that, especially in a playoff now, where you're going to have to win 1, 2, 3. You're going to have to play a lot of football in December and January. So depth is something that maybe we haven't talked about at this point that I think might be a big X factor once we start whatever this playoff's going to look like.
Yeah, everybody's talked about having the opportunity to not play in the conference championship game and how that can help you. But on the flip side, you've got to play another round against a quality opponent if you're in that first round, seeded 5 through 12, if you get in. But it's not just the SEC, Pete. It's also the Big Ten and the number one team in the country and undefeated Oregon Ducks. And we're going to find out if Indiana belongs in that realm this weekend when they go to Ohio State. There's time to talk about that on a later podcast this week. Mm-hmm. But I want to focus on Oregon for a minute.
Sure.
And I'll tell you something about that game at Wisconsin on Saturday night actually made me believe in the Ducks more. And here's what I mean by that. I reference all the time. In fact, Pat McAfee brought it up on Saturday, asked me about, some of the wisdom I gleaned from Lou Holtz over my decade with him. And Lou would talk about November teams either trying to win something or spoil something, and there are inherent pressures that go along with both. The other thing that he always said is you do not get the same football team every week. You don't just, get your team to a point and they just play that way every week. Oregon went into a place against a team that was trying to ruin things. It didn't have a lot to play for in terms of their own accomplishment, except for the opportunity to beat number one. They go on the road at night in an atmosphere that we all know can be extraordinarily difficult, although teams have certainly had success at Camp Randall. And Oregon, past the first couple of weeks of the season, the Idaho, the Boise State game, turns out Boise State's pretty good, but past those games, Oregon really hadn't had that hiccup where they probably didn't have their fastball, where they weren't throwing 98. They had to figure out how to get by on 94, and it wasn't really moving like it normally does. They were kind of leaving it in the dead zone and couldn't get the thing to move. You know what I mean? Using the baseball analogy. And yet, they made winning plays. And yet, Mateo Uiagalelei took over, made the plays when they had to be made. And so as much as people might have a knee-jerk reaction and say, oh, man, the Ducks, Wisconsin, they're not any good, and they went in there and they almost messed around and got beat. I think when you consider the way the Ducks have handled every bit of their two time zone or plus travel up to this point in the season, they were due one of these, and they won. And it makes me believe in them more. I don't look at it and see a bunch of warts. I'm like, this is a team that knows how to win.
Road night games
against good teams. Wisconsin is just that. They are a good team. They will likely go to a bowl. They are solid, but Oregon almost fought the environment as much as they fought the Badgers. I mean, Wisconsin fired its offensive coordinator after the game. They are imperfect right now and growing and evolving under Luke Fickell. But two things stood out for me from that game, Rece. One is Dan Lanning's such an interesting cat, and he's been such a fun study early in his career. I had a coach text me when he faked the field goal who said Dan Lanning is the epitome of fortune favors the bold. Like every day he walks fortune favors the bold. And like I think from now on, when I see Dan Lanning on the sideline, I will put a thought bubble over his head. It will say fortune favors the bold.
I hated that call, by the way. Hated it.
Oh, yeah. It was completely silly. It was completely silly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it reminded me a little bit of what we watched in Seattle last year, Rece, where he tried too much fortune from too much bold, and it backfired on him. Yeah. I thought it was interesting study when they came back. NBC came back from the TV break, and they played jump around, the obligatory jump around shot, right? And Oregon leaned into it. Now, they're not the first team to do that, but they were ready for it. They had clearly talked about it. Lanning was doing it. I thought that was like a cool moment where it was like, okay, this is how we're going to do this and how we're going to handle this. But the really gutsy call, I mean, the fake field goal was almost performative. The real gutsy call was that 4th and 9, I believe, in the first play of the fourth quarter.
Yep.
All right. They're at, I think, the -40, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's just not a call a lot of coaches make in a game, in sort of a team that lulls you into punt field position. They said, you know what, forget this. We're gonna go for it. And he said after the game, limited possessions, which I get, but both the play for Dylan Gabriel to create with his legs, separate, and give him just enough time, And then Terrence Ferguson, the tight end, and Oregon has as good a tight end room as anybody in the country, to go down, kind of stop and freeze in the very small window that was open. Now, Gabriel throws a dime to fit it there, but that's a really hard catch. And you know what that is? Those are two guys that played a lot of college football games, right? I don't have the number off the top of my head, but Dylan Gabriel, we know, has been, he's been playing since the Pac-8, it felt like, in all these different things. I mean, imagine who was in the American when he started at UCF compared to now. And Terrence Ferguson's a vet. He's playing a ton of big games. He's a, high-end NFL guy. Not high-end, but a good prospect. So to me, that just showed they have the guys who have the poise to make the plays.
Yeah, I am the believer in ugly wins. I always go back to, I remember my dad officiated a game at Clemson one year, and they barely beat like the Citadel or Wofford or one of those, state government contractually obligated games they have to play, like South Carolina's going to play this weekend. And they barely got by the game, and this is when Clemson was in the top 10 every year, and the question was thrown to Danny Ford. I think my first press conference was like, Danny, that was an ugly win. He said, yep, and I'll take 9 more of them right now. But then he talked about but being pushed a little bit. And, to your point, Rece, I think is something that we talked about a lot in August and September, but haven't talked about enough, which is, we're in the fatigue era now of these West Coast teams that are having to make these trips. I think Oregon's last weekend off was in the middle of September. And so that looked like a team that was like, you take your W, no matter how ugly it is, got much duct tape on it, pun intended, and then get out of there. But you need a couple of those. It's kind of like the Nick Saban loss, he don't want to lose a game, but sometimes he kind of wants to lose a game. And so you don't want to lose the game, but if you get pushed a little bit, now you can win. And this is what I'm talking about the playoff, because this felt like on the road, hostile environment, didn't play your best, trying to figure out where you can push it, where you can't push it, get your ugly win and get out of there. But a lot of teams are going to be in this situation when we get to December. And so I think that was a good one to take away. And yeah, I'm with you, Pete. Dan Lanning fascinates me. And I love that he loves college football so much. And I know his name it keeps coming up in NFL, whatever else. He loves college football so much that I think he was so excited to see the jump around. Like every time I talk to him, he's like, he wants to know, man, what's it like to go to a game at so-and-so? And what does so-and-so look like? And it's just, he sounds like those of us who just want to see all the games, and these guys don't get to watch a lot of games. So I feel like we weren't talking about Oregon maybe the last couple of weeks until that one. And so, just a quick reminder. And that team fascinates me.
I think it's because they don't quite have what we were talking about off the top in the Big Ten. They may have the best quartet of elite teams, potentially elite teams, but they don't have in the Big Ten right now, in my judgment, they don't have Missouri, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, maybe they have a Vanderbilt, something close. They don't have, maybe not the style of play that Vanderbilt does, maybe Illinois, who Oregon handled easily. But I think that's why, Ryan, is why it's not anyone was purposely ignoring Oregon, but once they got past Ohio State, it didn't really have that stage. They went to Purdue the Friday night after that, and Purdue is woeful, and they had Illinois came to them. So, they didn't have to deal with the road aspect of it. They don't play Penn State, so some of that, they don't play Indiana, so some of that has worked against them in terms of not getting the type of stage, but stage is coming and the Ducks are going to be ready for it because, they're going to go to the Big Ten championship game almost certainly, although Jed Fish would love to throw them into a tiebreaker and all of that to cap his solid first season there. Fortune favors the bold, says Pete Thamel. That applies to Dan Lanning, but fortune does not always smile on the same Cougar every day. And it did not smile on BYU as it has several times this year. Kansas, all of a sudden, is the epitome of the team that is playing to ruin things for people. They beat Iowa State, then they beat BYU, and they do it on a brilliant, it's probably technically just a pooch punt, but I like to think of it as a quick kick right there. It bounced off of touched a BYU player, and then Kansas took advantage of that, and the Cougars couldn't make the play. So this leads me to what I said on College Game Day on Saturday. And all due respect to Arizona State, who I think is really, really improved. obviously, with only 2 losses and a chance to get into the Big 12 championship game. I think the best team in the Big 12 is Colorado. It's not because they are deeper than everyone else. It's because they have more difference makers than everyone else, and they've got a quarterback. And there are some other quarterbacks in the league too. Kansas has a quarterback for sure. BYU's got a quarterback. Iowa State's got a quarterback. But Shedeur might be built a little bit differently. Travis Hunter, is ridiculous. I saw someone tweet afterwards that, okay, Travis Hunter hasn't made a bunch of tackles. All right, fair enough. Go ahead. And they were actually touting. It was from I don't even think it was a fan. I think it was another SID touting one of his defensive backs who made a bunch of tackles in the game. And I get that, but nobody's throwing at that guy. He'll just intercept it. If they throw it to him, he catches it. They ask him to pass it, and, well, it's not open. He's savvy enough to just run it in. He is a phenomenal athlete. He's the kind of guy who, when the teams are evenly matched in a conference that, I don't know, maybe we would describe it as wide, not deep. If you have deep difference makers, you can elevate in a game. Now, does that mean I think Colorado's a lock, to win and win out? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that right now I think they're the best team in the Big 12. What do you think, Pete?
Rece, I just really think you should start taking credit for your delayed genius of picking Kansas to win the Big 12.
Is that it? Yeah.
Because you first half of the season.
What I meant was that Kansas was going to decide who wins the Big 12. That was a bad pick. I know they're playing well now. Bad pick. Yeah. Bad pick.
Yeah. But they have become relevant in the Big 12 race because they keep beating people. And there they are. Poor old Kansas sitting there. Is that game at Arrowhead on Saturday?
Yes. It's a home game for Kansas. And obviously they're not playing in Lawrence this year. So I think it is. Yeah.
The Where Will Kansas Play football parlor game.
It is Arrowhead. That's
okay.
Right. Yeah.
They're back? Are they back, or they have another year of this?
That I don't know the answer to for sure. I think they're back, but I'm not going to swear to it in a court of law. Yeah.
Okay. No, I hope so.
Yeah, go play Coppin, right? You can do that now. That's if you can play at Wrigley, you can play at Coppin.
They played at the soccer stadium, I think, too.
They have played some at the soccer stadium, and I think there's been a couple Arrowheads, and this should be Arrowhead. Like it's kind of a spectacle, right? Mm-hmm. Like I just think, who wouldn't want to go see this Colorado team at this moment? And difficult to argue that they're number one. Seeing Arizona State jump on Kansas State, I believe they're up 21-0 in very short order, was one of those like scoreboard whiplashes of the weekend. You're like, whoa, certainly Arizona State is excellent, and they were picked dead last in the Big 12. I remember in Vegas, they had what I call at media days, Ryan, empty table syndrome.
Yes.
Because what do you have? However, 16 teams in the Big 12 now. There's a lot of coaches, a lot of things, and there was just like not a lot of people buzzing around the old Sun Devils. So give Kenny Dillingham credit. Coach Prime could end up as the Big 12 Coach of the Year, very likely, but I don't know if anybody's done more with less than Kenny Dillingham has. I went out, Rece, to their spring practice during the Final Four when we were out in Arizona. And I remember thinking, okay, this team's not bad. And then they lose Ed Woods, their best corner, to Michigan State, where he starts. They lose Elijah Badger, who's one of Florida's best receivers this year, was probably the best player on their roster. And they lost Jaden Rashada, which I don't think was a big loss, and kind of cleared the way for where they are now with Levitt. But it's been a remarkable roster overhaul, considering he took that job with the shroud of sanctions, with an NCAA investigation, and he said it the other day, like, people who take jobs when you're under sanctions typically get fired, especially at a place where nobody's really won with any significance or consistency in my lifetime. So hat tip to Arizona State. They are not the best team of the Big 12, but they have a chance to win the Big 12 in late November, and nobody thought that.
Okay, I'm reading this right here because all of this changes with the tiebreakers. Ryan, how about this one? Arizona State, almost certainly. It's not a lot, according to what I'm reading here, if we've got it deciphered properly. Almost a lot to get in the Big 12 championship game if it wins out. There is a scenario in which Arizona State winning out would leave them out, we think, according to tiebreakers. If they win out, And Iowa State, Colorado both went out, and BYU loses out, which would include a loss to Houston, which I know Houston clipped Kansas State, but that seems, even though they're playing much better, that seems relatively unlikely that they would lose out. I don't think that would favor the Sun Devils getting in. But for the most part, the most likely scenario is if they win their next two games, they're going to be in the Big 12 championship game.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. And by the way, I wanted to say, I picked NC State to be in the playoffs, so don't feel bad about it. No one needs to feel
Kansas.
bad about any Kansas picks or whatever else. But I want NC State. They got the quarterback and they got the veteran. Dorn's been there 100 years, whatever else. And the other thing is, hey,
you're not jaded enough from all those years on Tobacco Road.
No. All of my
State?
friends have said, I grew up a big North Carolina State fan. They're like, you didn't know better. Like we wouldn't, but they don't blame me for the jinx. That's good because the jinx already existed. But also, guess who else apparently had no tackles in his entire career as a defensive back? Deion Sanders. And it seemed to have worked out. I don't remember Deion taking anybody down. So yeah, I think Travis Hunter will be fine. But no, what I love about, and again, it's this idea of, because of the transfer portal and who you lost, but also who you picked up, is this idea of, and I don't want it to be like college basketball where it's a reset every year. But I do love the fact that you have so many teams. We're talking about Arizona State. I mean, even Wisconsin, Vanderbilt, whoever, that I don't know are good enough to win the conference, might back their way into a conference championship game. But I love the fact that there are so many teams that could ruin your year. I'm going to Texas this weekend. I don't really believe Kentucky can beat Texas.
They can't.
I was at the Georgia game. I mean, but they can make life difficult for them. So that part of it is, you have to watch the games, because even if you ultimately know who's going to win the game, I don't know if there are a lot of games, certainly in November, where you can't at least keep an eye on it because of what Pete just said, scoreboard whiplash.
But let's talk about, I want to react a little bit more to the Georgia-Tennessee game quickly before we wrap up. A couple other games too, but let's talk about this concept of evaluating teams and watching games. I watched Texas, and they looked like an elite team to me. And as I detailed on the podcast last week, the criteria, my first thing is, do you look the part? Well, Texas absolutely looks the part. How often do you reach that level? Texas has done that for the most part. One side of the ball, they didn't play well against Georgia. Georgia can do that to you from time to time. And then who does it come against? This is where you start. This is where the circular arguments begin with people. They start saying, who did you do it against? And saying, okay, what's your best win? Texas' best win is Vanderbilt.
Yep.
And it's going to remain that way until they go to Texas A&M, even if they beat Kentucky. Kentucky has played well against Georgia. They obviously played great against Ole Miss on the road, and then they've given up 500 yards to other people. And Jarquez Hunter probably would have, I think he ran for 270 or something from Auburn. He probably would have run for 400 if he hadn't gotten tired. I mean, Kentucky's strategy of let's let Hunter run until he gets tired didn't work. And, you don't know what you're getting, back to the Holtz point, with Kentucky for sure. But as it pertains to Texas, Texas is going to head down to College Station, almost certainly with one loss, a lock to make the playoff. And the best we've seen from them in terms of getting a victory is Vanderbilt.
Yep.
How does that impact the way you – and Vanderbilt's improved. I understand that. Vanderbilt beat Alabama and all of that and much, much improved. But if you're talking about an SEC champion team, potentially, the 2 seed and the whole thing, should they win out, and they'll have better wins than they would have A&M and they would have the SEC championship game. But you get to that point and that's it. I mean, how does that impact your evaluation of them, Pete?
You're just basically saying Texas is
Indiana, Rece.
There's not much difference. I mean,
what's Texas's strength of schedule? Is it in the 60s?
No, it's I just did this yesterday. Texas is 38.
38.
Texas
okay.
Strength of schedule's 38. It's right in line with Oregon, which is 43. BYU's 53. Miami's 54. Indiana's 106. So I don't think it's that. But it's not Georgia, it's not Alabama, in terms of who they've played.
So for the aggregators, that was sarcasm. I'm from Boston.
right,
I tend to
right.
practice sarcasm.
Sorry.
I do realize, and aware that Texas's schedule is different than Indiana's. There's some paradigm cases you could probably make.
The on insert number here will say Pete Thamel says Texas is like Indiana. Pete Thamel reveals that Texas is like Indiana.
ESPN analyst, compares Texas to.
I saw it on the X. It has to be true.
Yes, exactly. I am not worried about Texas because we are going to get at least one and then maybe a second really strong empirical evidence point from Texas. So they go to A&M, which again, if we're going to start like comparing, that's Notre Dame's best / only, win.
It's another good one to bring up. Yeah, great. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think like that, will reveal itself. A 2-loss Texas doesn't stack up super favorably if there's a car wreck of 2-loss SEC teams, right? Just because now they went and played Michigan, they should get some credit for at least like attempting to do that. I'm a fan of attempt. We've talked about that philosophically. You're not as much, Rece, and that's fine. But like at least like that venue, that game at that time, there should be something for that.
That I do agree with. That you take into consideration what it was at the moment. I do agree with that. Just for the aggregators.
Yes. So the way they lost to Georgia is maybe the most concerning thing to me, right? Like they got ragdolled in that game. Mm-hmm. And look, Georgia's really good. We saw that again the other night. And they have a resume. It's probably more comparable to Penn State's, right? They have a series of very good wins.
Right. Yeah.
And
great call.
And then they don't have quite the loss that Penn State has, but they have you can't just throw their resume away. We just have to say all league schedules, because these leagues are so big and bloated, are not built like each other. Right. And so we just can't compare them as SEC teams. And I think that's where the mistake comes, is we say, how many Big Ten teams, how many SEC teams? But these teams are barely in the same league. You know what I mean? Like they happen to play in the same conference, but that doesn't, necessitate equality in their schedule. It's like Wyoming and Vermont being in the same country, right? Yeah, it's America, just looks a lot different. So I think really when when the committee pairs down on this, I do think the individuality of resume and not lumping them together. I think something, it might have been you, Rece, it might have been Ryan, said that the 12 fills up pretty fast. Well, there's really 7, right? Mm-hmm. So say you have 6 SEC teams at 2, one wins the auto, that's 5. It gets pretty crowded pretty fast because you've got the Notre Dame case, which I think is going to end up more controversial than it is right now when you really start comparing wins. And then, Indiana's an 11-point underdog this weekend, so I think it's safe for me to say they're expected to lose by Vegas. Where they end up, or could end up as a one-loss team if they lose, and they can win. By the way, I'm not just saying that Indiana's going to go there and lose. They've executed too well and not flinched at any moment. So for me to just say that's it's an Ohio State win, and we could talk about what happens if they get blown out, but I just want to be clear that I don't think it's a certainty that they get blown out. So no, there's some fascinating theater, and I just feel bad for Ward Manuel because stuff he has said week 1 and week 2 is going to end up getting thrown back in his face, as it always does with these committee chairs.
And he's speaking for the rest. He's speaking for the rest of them, Ryan. That's the biggest thing. And I have pledged to ask Ward every week that we have him on, what are you going to do about the teams that break the tie, get into the conference championship game, have to play an extra game, and then by definition, they take a loss if it's a close one? That's one thing. Ryan, I want to hit you on this Indiana thing, and also want to take care of, once again, as I've found a dead horse to beat here. The aggregators should listen to this. The reason we talk about Indiana getting blown out is because it's the only thing that's interesting. Okay. And what I mean by that is this: if Indiana wins, obviously they're fine. If Indiana loses by a field goal and proves to be Ohio State's equal, or if they lose by a touchdown or 10 points, but they play well, I think that even given the fact that their resume or their strength of schedule is not so great, they probably belong in the field someplace. The only thing that's interesting is if they get boat raced. And if they get boat raced, then you start looking at the other things and go, okay, wait a minute. They're really good, improved, good for them, fantastic story that they got into the mix. But are they one of the 7 best teams in terms of the at-large field? That's why we're saying it, not because we expect it, not because we want it. It's because it's the only thing that's really interesting about in terms of the playoff for Indiana. Otherwise, it's going to take care of itself.
Yeah, no, and we talk about ugly wins being great for you, but ugly losses are way worse for you. You know, and I think that's what you have to look at, because what's striking is, if you kids want to go look at ESPN.com and you just click through everyone's schedules, it'll tell you where teams were ranked, when these games were played, and there's not a single number next to a single name on that Indiana schedule. And, I go back to, we used to do these mock, I haven't done one in several years, you guys might have, but these mock selection committee exercises, which I learned so much from. Rece, I know I was in the room with you for at least one of them. And what was fascinating was how the room changed depending on who was in the room. Like the first one I did was in Bristol, and it was just, it was all ESPN people. And the second one I did was in Texas, and it was all sports writers. And the third one I did was in Texas, and it was me and a bunch of guys who had played college football. And the mentality in the room was so different, and the way they treated scheduling in particular. And the question I would ask in the room every time, and it would drive Bill Hancock crazy, was, does intent to schedule matter? So like if you're Texas and you schedule a road trip at Michigan, do you get credit for that, even though Michigan isn't the team that we thought that they are? But in between that, you play Colorado State, UT San Antonio, and Louisiana Monroe. Like that's how they started their season. And so, Indiana, this is the schedule primarily they were handed. They did schedule FIU and Western Illinois, but they didn't know UCLA was going to be like this. They did schedule Charlotte right up the road from where I'm sitting right now. We all knew they weren't going to be great. But what was your intent when you scheduled? And so, if you're Notre Dame,
their intent was to pray to go 6-6 because they're friggin' Indiana.
Yeah, they've lost more games than anyone in the history of the sport.
Right. But I say all that to get to another team in the state of Indiana, which is Notre Dame. And I'm so fascinated by this Army game this weekend because it's their entire season, because they have their ACC deal. I get it. They got their Texas A&M one. That's great. But I just, they play Stanford. They always play Stanford. They play Florida State, which is great. They're playing USC, which is, not the USC that they certainly were hoping they were going to be, that we didn't think they're going to be. It's just that the schedule matters. And my favorite part of those exercises is when you can say, give me these 4 schedules and throw them up on a screen together. To me, that's it. That's the whole thing. Who did you play? What did you do when you got there? And an ugly loss in a push, to me, is the biggest minus on the board. And so, yeah, if Indiana has an ugly loss this weekend, then what a great story. We'll see you guys play on December 31st or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If they play well, then you are probably taking a bit of a leap. Because last week, the only team with a winning record that Indiana had played was Nebraska. And then after Nebraska got jobbed by the no defensive holding / pass interference call in the end zone, although it's Nebraska in a close game, they probably wouldn't have gotten the 2-point conversion anyway. But after that, they fell back to 500. And now Washington is the only team they've played that has a winning record. So you're taking a bit of a leap of faith if they go in there and, let's say they lose by 10. You're giving them some credit. And a lot of their schedule they couldn't control because it was handed to them by the Big Ten. And no one knew Indiana was going to be this good and would be a wildly attractive team for national television. But as it turns out, they didn't get a lot of the marquee games, save they thought Michigan would be one. Turns out it was in a lot of ways, even though Michigan's not what it normally is. The reason I don't go for the intent to schedule thing, unless you intentionally try to go bad, is because of, my family laughs at me because, people like to say, maybe, I don't know who started it, Belichick or whoever, it is what it is. And anytime anybody says that in my house, I say, because it's never what it's not. Is what it is, but it's never what it's not. And so the schedule has to be taken not just for what it is, but for what it's not. Just because you thought Florida State was going to be a marquee game, even though that's a part of their ACC deal, it's not. USC, it's not. You don't get that credit for it. You have to determine what the schedule is. And because look, we talk a lot about the Texas-Michigan game, and you can talk about the Notre Dame-USC game. They're fine. You're just not getting a marquee bump from it. I mean, It's not like Michigan is crushing your strength of schedule for Texas. It's not like it's killing it. You just had the misfortune that it's not a marquee game. Take Ohio State, for instance, this weekend, right? Ohio State didn't have, some big non-conference game. But do you think they really expected Indiana to be a chance for a marquee win? And it is. So if you're going to give credit unexpectedly, you can't give the old, Florida State, that knucklehead Rece Davis had them in the playoff in the preseason. They're going to win 2 games, or whatever, which, by the way, that's a worse pick than Kansas, come to think of it, as it turns out. And
I had them too.
So,
I
think
we all did.
I think a lot of people did. But anyway, I'm just saying, evaluate it for what it is. And I don't get into the whole intent thing, because the intent can go sideways. And I'm sure Kirk Cignetti had known that, and he did. He told Pete early, expected to be, 6-0, 7-0, whatever it was. But if he had known he was going to be on this playoff stage, you don't think he would have chosen to play Penn State? He wouldn't have taken a swing at Oregon? Sure he would.
Well, there was 6-0 for them, and then the playoff. There was 6-0 meant like they could be in the top 25 and make a bowl and have like the greatest season in Indiana history, by the way. Right. Like nobody would have been, if they went 10-2 this year, I don't think there would have been a whole lot of unhappy Indiana fans, right? So just a credit to him and the monster he's created there. It's one of the most out of the blue stories in the history of college football, and all credit to them, even if their schedule isn't what it is. So
it reminds me so much. Talking Oregon, it reminds me of so much of Oregon back in the day. I remember when Oregon played Wake Forest in the Poulan Weed Eater Independence Bowl, and it was the biggest game they had played since the one time they went to the Rose Bowl and whatever. Oregon was awful. Kids, Kansas State was the worst program in the history of college football until Bill Snyder got there. This is my favorite thing in the world. And again, this is coming from the writer of the bottom 10. The best part of the bottom 10 is when a team, Kansas was a stalwart of the bottom 10 the first 9 years I wrote it. And when they finally turn the corner, it's the greatest thing in the world. They're my favorite stories. They are. And it's so for Indiana to do this, it's just, again, if they ended right now, arguably the greatest season they've ever had. And if the college football tooth fairy had come to you in July, Bloomington, and said, you can have this many wins and play in the whatever on January the 1st, you would have said, thank you very much. Let's fast forward to the end. But I love the fact that they're going to be disappointed now. They will be disappointed if they're not in the playoff. That's the greatest.
They didn't beat Michigan by enough.
Yeah. How about that? Yeah. How about that?
Yeah.
I mean, what were they, 10-62 before that game against Michigan? I mean, beating Michigan, period, is enough. They're still Michigan. And by the way, Michigan was in spoiler mode. They had the entire role reversal between those two of Indiana being the team trying to protect something, and it showed with 18 yards of offense in the second half against Michigan, and Michigan trying to ruin things for Indiana is one of the reasons this season has been so filled with drama. McGee, give me a quick reaction. A lot of the Tennessee folks are very unhappy with the gentleman who wore stripes. Those are your worlds colliding. There with the guys in stripes and the guys in orange. Were you as unhappy with the 12 men on the field penalty and some of the other things that the Vol faithful are upset about?
Yeah, well, listen, 12 men on the field. That I'll say this: that rule is that rule. And if you got one toe on the field, it is what it is. I mean, it just and you're talking to a guy that I grew up. My brother and I both to this day, because Dad was a field judge. You count players. I mean, my brother had the worst seats in the house when Wake Forest and Louisville played in the Orange Bowl, literally sitting underneath the scoreboard in the upper deck. And my brother stands up. He goes, they got 12 men on the field. And sure enough, there was a penalty. And this guy looked at him and he goes, do you count the number of players on defense every play? He's like, yeah, don't you? That's what I'm saying. But the rule is the rule. I mean, that is what, but I will say this. I base it on the number of text messages I received from either side. And the number of text messages I received from East Tennessee was an avalanche. Never heard from Dad. And what that tells you is that, one side was probably right and there was no defense on the other. But give credit to Josh Heupel for one of the greatest. He's not exactly a media darling. Great guy.
You think?
No, great guy, but just never gives you a lot. Privately, he will, but publicly with a bunch of microphones just doesn't do it. But I thought that was pretty brilliant what he did. And if folks haven't seen it, it's on the interweb. But the question came up about the first call, and he just turned the microphone around. Could you explain what you think happened on that call? And then well, can I ask you? And then he says, would you like to ask me about the 12th men penalty? He said, yeah. And he just turns the microphone back around to the room. And it was, you can't get fined for something that the guy from the Knoxville News Sentinel asked.
Follow up on face mask. When we watched the replay,
yeah, what did it look like?
It looked like the back of the helmet popped off. We didn't see a hand on the face mask. What was the explanation?
Can you repeat that?
It looked like his helmet popped off, so there wasn't a hand. SEC office. Next question.
Heupel's not exactly, like I said, nobody's going to put together a highlight reel of his press conferences, but when they do, that's the one clip they're going to show. It's pretty good.
Didn't he on the face mask be like, oh, the one on 2nd and 15? Or like
put
the down and distance back on and be like, oh, the one where we were sure to get the ball back?
Yeah. Let's make sure we put again, we're talking about context. Let's put it within the context that it existed. Now, I thought it was pretty brilliant. But that game to me, and it was really interesting having been in the rain at Ole Miss the weekend before and seeing Georgia. And then seeing Georgia at home. But the road is a monster. Like the road is such a monster. And it's striking how, Carson Beck's a perfect example. Carson Beck had not played a home game in more than a month, as we all talked about. And he looked like a different human being playing at home and versus being on the road. And so the road is a monster. And that's why, even if you don't think you're going to win your conference, you've got to do whatever you can do to make sure you're not at someone else's place those first 2 days of that playoff.
And the road being a monster doesn't just have to be in front of a big light show between the hedges in Athens. It can be even in the remote outpost of college football, which brings us to best in game, Ashton Jeanty. Again, 159 yards, 32 carries, 3 touchdowns, bringing his total to almost 1,900 yards and leading the Boise State Broncos back from an early deficit against Tien Niumatalolo and San Jose State and winning 42-21 and even coming up with a goal line stand in the waning moments of the game, the waning seconds, stopping them twice from inside the 2-yard line, which was very, very significant to some. But Ashton Jeanty is our best in the game this week. You're grinning, Ryan. Why?
To some. I love it.
To some.
That's old school. For entertainment purposes only. That's I love it.
It is, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because people know if Pete gets sick and tired, and I don't blame him. If I were on the other side of this, I'd be sick and tired of hearing about it too. The whole Superdog thing. It's ridiculous because, of course, you want to win. But over the last several years, however long we've been doing this has evolved into Herb Street and I take more delight in the other guy losing than we do whether ours come home. So I've got the 4-box up Saturday night, watching Boise State realize that, oh no, they're only up 35-21. Stinking Herb Street is going to get this by half a point. He's going to cover. And, at least he's not going to win outright. So that's good. He's going to cover. This stinks. Get a pick 6. Right? They throw the interception. As soon as I see it, I jump up and I'm yelling like it's the biggest game ever. I'm like, go, 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 touchdown. I'm going nuts, nuts. And then they get the stop at the end too. And there was more rejoicing in the Davis household, which is completely preposterous. And maybe why I hope, although we bore our coworkers to tears, and for that I apologize, but I hope that the people at home sort of understand that the reason we do this is because we love the sport on all levels, and there's like this camaraderie of busting each other's chops. Do I really care if Herb Street loses the Super Bowl? No, it just makes the text chain fun, in the middle of the night and stuff. So it's like you're a little kid again, and you're watching the game. You want to be right. You want your buddy to be wrong, or more than that, you want your buddy to be wrong. It doesn't really matter if you're right or not. So it was fun.
I'll say this about I don't gamble. We all don't gamble. We can't gamble because of our jobs. But we'll make a lunch bet or a friendly bet, or pick games on the podcast and root for them. With Steve and everything. You can see why people would gamble, right? Like that moment you're talking about, Rece.
Yeah.
Like you can see. Oh, yeah. Like you're in it. You're like you all of a sudden have such a visceral tie to San Jose State Boise, which I don't think Rece Davis from Muscle Shoals, Alabama would wake up in the morning. You know what I mean? Like it's just unlikely. Now you obviously love the sport and would be tracking that game anyway, but you're jumping.
You're right. Once it went 35-21, I'm out. Yeah, it's a great point. I'm sorry, Pete. Continue.
And I was watching that game, and when they went up 2 touchdowns, I changed the channel. And then I was like, man, they got another touchdown really fast. Wonder what happened. Didn't really care because it was like not, there's the games you're monitoring and they're like, oh, don't have to monitor that anymore. It's over. And like SMU BC on Saturday. Oh, 1-score game coming down the pike. Oh, don't have to watch it anymore. Whatever it is. So yeah, but that thing that pulls you in, that it's hard to describe, you can see why people would sit there on Saturdays and find investment in games that they would have no ties to.
And we don't condone it for the aggregators. We don't condone gambling. All right, go ahead, Ryan.
No, just say it's just the passion for it. I always tell a story about my brother's job years ago was to keep me, this was before I hit the road, was to keep me away from my house because my wife was planning a surprise birthday party. And we're sitting there at some sports bar or whatever. Like, man, we've been over here for like 6 hours. It's time to go home. My brother goes, no, man. Oregon State's kicking off. And I go, yeah, okay, great. I go, but it's time to go. And my brother goes, yeah, but we hate Dennis Erickson. And I was like, damn, I do hate Dennis Erickson. And sat there and watched the game for the next 3 hours. And had to do with Dennis Erickson yelling at our dad during a game somewhere at some point or whatever. I'm sure Dennis Erickson's a great guy, but he kept me for, he set up my surprise birthday. But the point is, you love it. And that's why I just, back in the old ESPN goal, was the goal line, game zone, whatever it was, where I'd pay $150. And I told Timmy Chang this earlier this year. When my daughter was born, the only thing that kept me sane in the fall of 2004 was watching Timmy Chang hang 5 touchdowns on Nevada at 3 o'clock in the morning because I'm down in the basement with the diaper bag. So, yeah, it's why, I mean, people ask all the time about why we do this, and we can't believe we get to do it because we love it. We love it. And sometimes the super dog is your I hate Dennis Erickson moment.
That's it. And I'll leave you with this. There were a lot of candidates for dumb loses more than smart wins. The great saying of Bob Knight. Also, the mental is to the physical as 4 is to 1. Also, Bob Knight. You could say that maybe Jake Dickert's clock management at the end and saying the analytics book, and he went home back to Pullman with a bunch of timeouts in his pocket and had 21 seconds to try to rescue himself in Albuquerque. And he took the left in Albuquerque and also took the L. Shout out Bronco Mendenhall came through on the Superdog, but I digress. So you could say that would be one. You could look at the Pitt penalty after penalty after penalty against Clemson, which thwarted a scoring opportunity for them when they got very close in the red zone. But all of those are things that happen, and they don't rise quite to the level of what happened on the farm Saturday, Louisville and Stanford. Now, what happened was Stanford, this game was headed to overtime, and Stanford completes a 1-yard pass, run out of bounds, and they're out of field goal range. The flag that flew was not egregious. It was not. It was a personal foul penalty then that gave Stanford a 57-yard attempt after. There was a little shove. A guy ran a Stanford receiver out of bounds, and then as they untangled, several feet out of bounds, he gave him a little shove. Was it egregious? No. I don't know what he said, but he threw the flag. My point in dumb loses more than smart win, because there was a tag team partner with this too, is that The mental is to the physical as 4-1. You cannot give the guy the opportunity to throw the flag. Should he have thrown a flag? Fair point. Good debate. I'm here for it. Probably would have preferred to see him keep it in his pocket. But you cannot give him the opportunity to put your team in position to lose. And then 57 yards out. If the guy makes the field goal, tip your hat to him. I know these guys are unleashing howitzers and making them from the next county, but from 57 on grass, it's Stanford. They haven't won anything. Make them make the field goal. Instead, you jump offside, and now you've given them 20 yards. And you know what happened? They made the field goal. Stanford wins. Dumb loses. More than smart wins. Even if you get a little hint of dumb to the guy who threw the flag and put them in that position. 4-1. Mental to physical as 4-1. We invite you to download the College Game Day Podcast wherever you prefer to get your podcasts, or subscribe and never miss any of the rants. But if you do, you can always depend on the aggregators.